This is my response to the worst argument in all of ever. Part 4, Hitler's Table Talk. Recall that in previous parts of this series of videos we mentioned that Izamen claimed that the diaries from which Hitler's table talk were derived were in fact a forgery. Remember that I also said that Izamen's statements were meant as propaganda, and that I showed that he doesn't believe what he himself says, and I wouldn't either. Also, in his video, Izamen said, "Now we can argue all day about the authenticity of the Hitler's table talk and the diaries, but I'm not going to." Well, this is because Izamen got himself into such a deep hole in this particular part of the debate that he couldn't see a way out of it. Well, not without admitting that he'd been lying or that he'd made a mistake because he didn't know what he was talking about. From a tactical point of view, I don't need to argue. I can just agree with him that Hitler's table talk is a forgery. However, as with all facts claimed by Izamen, he is wrong. It is not the source documents that were forged, but the French and English translations that had been tampered with. So let's look at Hitler's table talk. 1. The secretary of the Nazi Party, Martin Bormann, was tasked with recording the conversations of Adolf Hitler in the Nazi bunker during the war. 2. The diaries so formed were intended to be published at a later date after the war was won, as a historical tribute to Hitler. As such, they should not be considered in any way to be a set of private statements. 3. Under these circumstances, Hitler would have been just as guarded with his choice of words in Hitler's table talk as in any other of his public speeches and documents. So quotes from Hitler's table talk were not suitable for the purpose of providing private statements as used in Izamen's argument. Basically, Izamen was barking up the wrong tree. Let's look at the original diaries or notes, whatever you prefer to call them, of Hitler's table talk. Martin Bormann had stenographers record Hitler's conversations. What I call Diary A was recorded by Heinrich Heim from 1941 to the middle of 1942. Diary B was recorded by Dr. Henry Picker from mid-1942 to the end of 1942. And Diary C was once again recorded by Heinrich Heim from 1943 to the end of 1944. What was colloquially known as Part 2 of Hitler's table talk should not be confused with Part 1, as it had nothing to do with Martin Bormann, Heinrich Heim, or Dr. Henry Picker. It was just a total fabrication by Francois Guénoud. Let's now consider the published copies of Hitler's table talk. In total, there were 4 versions published of Hitler's table talk. The first was published in the German language in 1951 by Dr. Henry Picker and called Hitler's table talk in the Central Headquarters 1941 to 42. It was based on the first 2 diaries. The second version was published in the French language in 1952, translated, interpolations added, and published by Francois Guénoud. Francois Guénoud also produced a Part 2 which he called Hitler's Last Testament. Now here's where it gets complicated. Norman Cameron and R.H. Stevens took Part 1 of Guénoud's work and translated it to English. They then obtained a third diary from Martin Bormann and translated it directly to English. Hugh Trevor Roper wrote an introduction and slapped it all together and published it in 1953 as the English version of Hitler's table talk. Note that by doing it this way, Francois Guénoud's interpolations became embodied in the English version. And finally, in 1980, Diaries A and C were published in the German language, called Monologue in the Central Headquarters, the notes of Heinrich Heim, edited by Werner Jochmann. They were published minus Diary B due to a copyright dispute with Henry Picker. The phrase, "the disease of Christianity," was not found in either of the German editions of Hitler's Table Talk, but was in both the French and the English translations. So the source of the interpolation can be traced to Francois Guénoud. Whether it's the result of a translation error or a deliberate insertion is unknown. But one thing we can be sure of is that Hitler was not the source. What was colloquially known as Hitler's Table Talk Part 2 was first published in the French language by Francois Guénoud in 1959. The cover of the book is illustrated on the screen. It was then translated to English and an introduction was added by Hugh Trevor Roper. This translation was published in 1961 as Hitler's Last Testament. Later, Francois Guénoud admitted to fabricating it. When questioned about the forgery, Guénoud replied, "But it is just what Hitler would have said, isn't it?" It would appear that Francois Guénoud was delusional enough to think that he was able to speak for Hitler on his behalf. Francois Guénoud may also have been imposing his own thoughts onto the legend of Hitler in Part 1 of Hitler's Table Talk. This may well explain the reason for the errors that we found that were introduced. In comments, Izamen suggests, if you want exact comments, read Mein Kampf and Hitler's Table Talk. The trouble is that Izamen could not even be bothered to read them himself. If he had, he would have known that the Dinesh D'Souza quote was not in Mein Kampf, and that Heinrich Heim and Dr. Henry Picker wrote the source documents that became Hitler's Table Talk, as demonstrated in the following. When Izamen called me a liar. When I said the notes of Henry Picker and Heinrich Heim were the source documents for Hitler's Table Talk, Izamen said, "Sorry, bud, you're a damn liar," on the basis that they were written by one secretary, not two. In fact, since I had to hammer the point home, he also implied that I was a moron. "Are you a moron? Those diaries were proven to be fake." But recently, Izamen posted, 2 of Hitler's personal secretaries testified and wrote a book about his comments in their presence, where he states it, "If you want exact comments, read Hitler's Table Talk." Well, as with leading a horse to water, it's difficult to make Izamen think. But congratulations, Izamen, you've actually managed to learn something. This means that you now qualify as a liar and a moron. Well, that's what the old Izamen would have called you, and you can't argue with yourself, can you? Contrary to what Izamen has said, Konrad Kujur did not write the diaries of Dr. Henry Picker and Heinrich Heim. Konrad Kujur did not admit to forging these diaries. Why would he? He didn't write them. However, Francois Guénoud admitted to forging what's colloquially known as Part 2 of Hitler's Table Talk. The diaries of Heinrich Heim and Dr. Henry Picker were the source documents to Hitler's Table Talk. This is a fact, and it's not really open to debate, as Izamen seems to think. Most of the errors in the English translation of Hitler's Table Talk are due to interpolations by the translator, Francois Guénoud. All the Hitler quotes used by Izamen in my debate with him from Hitler's Table Talk were from Guénoud's interpolations. That is, they're not genuine. So why does Izamen get so much wrong? Answer: it's because all of Izamen's YouTube comments are meant as propaganda that bear little or no resemblance to the truth, but are merely designed to sway the masses. That's the end of part 4 of this series of videos, which was on Hitler's Table Talk. Next up, part 5, is on the communists Kim Jong-il, Stalin and Jesus.